The morning arrived quietly, the way mornings do when the world already knows something heavy is coming. Across Britain, people woke up and reached for their phones before they even got out of bed. The news had broken the night before. Now it sat in every household like a cold stillness that no one quite knew how to shake off. A beloved figure was gone. Someone who had been part of the national story for decades. And now the country was being asked to say goodbye. At Kensington Palace, the lights had been on through the night. Staff moved in hushed tones through the corridors, speaking only when necessary, their footsteps careful on the polished floors. There was an unspoken understanding among everyone present. This was not an ordinary day, and it would not be treated as one. Every detail mattered. Every gesture carried weight. And those responsible for getting things right knew that the eyes of an entire nation, much of the world, would be watching. Prince William was already dressed by 6 in the morning. He stood near the tall window in his private study, looking out at the grounds where the early mist still clung to the grass. His expression was composed, the way a man's face becomes when he has spent years learning to hold grief quietly. He had seen loss before, had lived through it in a way most people never do, and in front of cameras that never seemed to look away. He knew what was expected of him. He also knew that what was expected and what he felt inside were two very different things. Catherine was with him within minutes, appearing at the doorway in a dark dress, her hair simply done. Her face calm but carrying that particular kind of softness that comes after a night of little sleep. She did not say much at first. She came to stand beside him, close enough that their arms touched. And for a moment, the two of them simply looked out at the gray morning together. It was the kind of silence that speaks more than words ever could, to people who have learned to carry weight together. Finding strength in the simple fact of standing side by side, the day ahead would be long and public and demanding, in ways that few people ever truly understand. There would be ceremonies, motorcades, official statements, and the careful choreography of a national farewell. But before any of that began, there was a quiet moment in a private room. Two people allowing themselves to simply feel what they felt before the doors opened and the world came in. Downstairs, advisors were arriving. The machinery of a royal farewell was beginning to turn, and it moved with a precision that bordered on the mechanical. Schedules were confirmed. Routes were checked. Security teams conducted their final sweeps. Florists arrived with arrangements of white and pale cream, colors chosen to honor a life rather than mark only its ending. Every flower had been selected deliberately. Every detail had been discussed and approved in the days prior, because when the monarchy mourns, it does so with a formality that reflects the gravity of what has been lost. Out in the streets of London, people were already gathering. They came on foot and by train and by bus, some from neighboring towns, some from much further away. They brought flowers and handwritten notes. They brought photographs printed from home, the edges still warm from the printer. They came in coats and scarves against the March chill, standing quietly on pavements, waiting. Some were elderly and remembered a different era. Others were young and had grown up knowing this person only through screens and newspapers, yet still felt the pull of something larger than themselves, a shared sense of belonging to a story that is now turning one of its final pages. By mid-morning, William and Catherine had been briefed on the day's full program. They sat together in a formal meeting room with senior aides, listening carefully as each element of the service was walked through. William asked several questions about timing, about particular moments in the ceremony he wanted to understand clearly. He was focused in the way that people become when emotional expression is not available to them in a professional setting. He was a future king preparing to perform a duty that came before personal feeling. And yet, those who were in the room that morning would later say that there was something unmistakable beneath his composed surface of sun. A man carrying something that no title or protocol could fully contain. Catherine, for her part, brought a steadiness to the room that anchored those around her. She had become over the years remarkably skilled at this, at being a presence that calms without demanding attention. She asked about the children, quietly, away from the formal discussion. She wanted to know how much they would see, what they would be asked to do, how the day would be explained to them in terms they could hold. The answer was that they had already been spoken to gently, carefully, in the way that adults speak to children about loss, when they want to protect without misleading. George, Charlotte, and Louis had been told what they needed to know, and they had responded as children sometimes do, with a simplicity and a directness that made the adults in the room catch their breath. The nation, meanwhile, had begun to come together in that particular way it does at moments of collective grief. Flags hung at half-mast. Television schedules had been cleared. Radio programs shifted to softer, more reflective content. In churches across the country, doors were open through the day for those who wanted to sit in stillness and have somewhere quiet to go. It was a very British kind of morning, restrained on the surface, but deep beneath. The kind that fills train carriages with silence and causes strangers to exchange small, solemn nods on the street. As if acknowledging each other's sadness without needing to name it, William left Kensington Palace just after noon. As his car moved through the streets, he could see the crowds beyond the tinted glass, rows of people standing still, many holding flowers, some with their hands pressed to their chests. He did not look away. He held their gaze through the window, even knowing they could not see him in return. It was his way of honoring their presence, of acknowledging that they had come, that they were there, that they too were part of this. Catherine followed in a separate vehicle, composed and graceful, her dark coat buttoned to the collar against the cold air. As the two cars moved slowly through the city, flanked by a quiet escort, London seemed to hold its breath. The bells of a nearby church began to ring low and slow and sonorous, filling the air. With a sound that had marked the passing of great figures for centuries, the farewell had begun. The cathedral was already full by the time the first official motorcade arrived. People had been seated for the better part of an hour, filling the ancient pews in careful ordered rows, their voices subdued to near silence the moment they stepped through the great doors. The building itself seemed to absorb sound, the stone walls, the vaulted ceiling, the heavy wooden fixtures that had witnessed centuries of history. It was the kind of space that reminded people, without saying a word, that they were small and that what was happening here was larger than any one of them. Outside, the crowd stretched along the pavements in both directions as far as a person could comfortably see. They stood behind the metal barriers that had been put in place the previous afternoon, their breath forming small clouds in the cold air. There were people of every age, every background, young mothers with children on their shoulders, retired couples who had driven down from the Midlands before sunrise, students who had skipped lectures and felt no guilt about it. They all shared the same quiet purpose: to be present, to witness, to mark the moment with their physical presence, because some things cannot be adequately honored from a living room sofa. When William's car came into view, a murmur moved through the crowd like a wave. Not the kind of noise that greets a celebrity or a performer. Something softer than that. A collective exhale. A recognition. He stepped out of the vehicle with the measured composure that had become, over the years, one of his defining qualities in public: the ability to move through difficult moments without letting them visibly pull him apart. He was dressed in dark military uniform, medals precise on his chest, posture straight, his expression one that had been sculpted by years of duty into something that read as dignified even when what lay behind it was grief. Catherine emerged a moment later and stood beside him, and the two of them paused, just briefly, just long enough to allow the moment its weight before moving toward the cathedral entrance. She wore a long dark coat, a small black hat set neatly at her brow, and pearl earrings that caught the pale winter light. She looked, as she often did in these moments, like she had been made for exactly this, not in a cold or performative way, but in the sense that she always seemed to understand the emotional register required and meet it. With remarkable precision, they greeted the gathered officials at the entrance. A series of quiet handshakes and solemn nods. Words were exchanged in low voices. There was no warmth in the social sense. This was not that kind of occasion. But there was courtesy and respect and the shared recognition among people who understood what public duty required of them that today demanded their absolute best. Inside, as William and Catherine were shown to their places, the organ began to play. a slow, measured peace that filled every corner of the vast space, rising into the ceiling and settling back down like something breathing. The music did not ask to be listened to so much as it asked to be felt, and the congregation, to their collective credit, received it that way. Heads bowed slightly, hands folded. The quiet deepened. The service began with words spoken by a senior clergyman. Carefully chosen words about a life that had touched many. About the particular kind of presence that some people carry that makes the world feel different once it is gone. He did not overreach. He did not try to make the moment more than it was, and that restraint was itself a form of respect. He spoke plainly about service, about devotion, about what it means to give a life to something larger than oneself. And as he spoke, the cathedral held absolutely still. William listened with his hands clasped in his lap, eyes forward. Occasionally, his jaw would tighten, a small and almost imperceptible movement that most people in the room would never catch. Catherine sat beside him, occasionally glancing at him with quiet attentiveness, not intrusively. Not in a way that called attention to itself, but in the way of a partner who monitors without hovering, who is present without crowding. She was his anchor in that moment, and the role suited her with the natural ease of something long practiced. Several readings followed, delivered by people who had known the deceased personally, people whose voices caught, just slightly at certain words, and who then composed themselves and carried on. There was something deeply moving about watching people do that. About seeing someone fight briefly with emotion in front of hundreds and then win the fight. Not because they had stopped feeling, but because they had decided that the words mattered more than their own composure. The congregation responded to each reading with a silence that felt like applause. Then came the music, a hymn that everyone present seemed to know. It's a kind of hymn that lives in the body before it lives in the mind. The voices of the congregation rose together, tentative at first, then stronger, filling the space with something that went beyond sound. William sang too, quietly, his eyes on the page of the order of service he held in both hands. It was a small thing, but it was visible, and it mattered because it said that he was not merely presiding over this moment, but participating in it, allowing it to reach him the way it reached everyone else outside. On the vast screens that had been erected along the processional route, the crowds watched the service unfold in silence. The flowers they had brought lay in great piles along the barriers, petals softening in the cold air. Some people had their hands pressed together. Others had their arms around each other. Here and there, shoulders shook, and those standing nearby offered a hand or a quiet word without being asked. Because grief, when it is shared, calls out a certain kind of instinctive kindness in ordinary people. The cameras inside the cathedral moved with careful restraint, capturing the scene without exploitation. A hand resting on a pew, a face in profile turned upward, toward the high windows. Light falling through stained glass onto stone floors, in colors that seemed almost too beautiful for the occasion. And always the faces, the human faces, doing the quiet. Difficult work of saying goodbye to someone who would not be coming back. William did not cry. Not visibly. But those who knew him, who had watched him through years of public life, would later say that in certain moments during that service, something moved behind his eyes that had no name. The farewell was real, and it was raw. And it was witnessed by a nation that needed exactly this, a moment of collective feeling. Held inside the walls of an ancient building, shared between the great and the ordinary alike. When the service concluded, and the great doors of the cathedral opened again, the cold air rushed in like something that had been waiting patiently outside. The congregation rose, and the formal procession began. Slow, deliberate, each step considered. The coffin moved through the cathedral on the shoulders of men, who had rehearsed this moment many times, but whose faces showed, nonetheless, the weight of what they carried. Not just the physical weight, the other kind, the kind that comes from being trusted with something irreplaceable. William walked directly behind, and the sight of him in that position, composed upright, eyes forward, drew a low sound from the crowd outside that was not quite crying and not quite silence. It was something in between. The sound of thousands of people experiencing the same thing at the same moment and having no adequate way to express it. He had walked in processions like this before. He had done it as a boy in a situation far more devastating than this one, and the entire world had watched him then, too. That memory lived in him, as it lived in the public consciousness, and both William and the watching crowd carried it quietly forward. Catherine walked a step behind and to the side. Her presence steady, her posture impeccable. She had in recent years developed an ability to carry sadness gracefully, not by suppressing it, but by giving it a shape that was dignified without being distant. She looked like a woman who understood exactly where she was and what the moment required, and who had made the private decision to give it everything she had. As the procession moved outside, the crowd that had been waiting for hours released something they had been holding. The applause, when it came, was not the kind that follows a performance. It was the kind that arises from deep feeling, from respect, from gratitude. It was slow and sustained, not celebratory, but honoring. People clapped because they did not know what else to do with their hands, because standing in silence felt insufficient, because sometimes a crowd needs to make noise to feel that it has truly said something. Along the route, flowers had been thrown gently onto the path in the traditional manner. Petals in white and yellow and pale pink lay on the cold stone, crushed softly underfoot by the procession as it passed. Some people reached through the barriers to lay single stems directly as close as they could get. A few held photographs against their chests. One elderly woman in a red coat pressed her fingers to her lips and extended them outward, a gesture so private and so instinctive that it went beyond ceremony altogether. William noticed her. His gaze passed across the crowd as it always did on these occasions, not in the studied, practiced way of someone performing attention, but in the genuine way of someone who understood that the people behind those barriers had made a choice to be there. They had woken early and traveled and stood in the cold for hours. That meant something. He could not stop. Protocol did not allow for it. But he held their gaze when he could, and those who caught his eye would carry that moment home with them. After the procession, formal motorcade moved through wider London streets toward the committal. The route had been published in advance, and people had positioned themselves along it for miles. Office workers stood outside their buildings in their lunch breaks, hands clasped before them. Construction workers in visibility jackets stood on scaffolding above, hard hats in hand, heads bowed. Taxi drivers had pulled to the sides of streets and stood beside their vehicles, respectful and still. It was one of those rare occurrences in London, perhaps the only city in the world where such a thing happens, where the noise simply stops, not because anyone has ordered it to, but because people choose it. Inside the vehicle, William sat looking straight ahead. There was no public performance required of him in that brief private transit. An aide sat across from him, saying nothing, understanding that nothing was required. The streets rolled past the windows in silence, in slow-motion faces, flowers, flags, and William took it all in with the measured attention of a man who had learned, very young, that these moments are borrowed, that they pass, and that you must be present for them even when presence is painful, because absence is not a choice that his position afforded him. Meanwhile, Catherine had been in brief contact with the palace regarding the children. George, Charlotte, and Louis had watched portions of the service from a protected setting, supervised carefully by trusted staff. They had been prepared for what they would see, and they had responded with the remarkable adaptability of children who have been raised to understand, from early on, that their family's life contains responsibilities that most families never carry. Charlotte, especially, had asked questions that were thoughtful beyond her years. Questions about the ceremony, about why certain things were done in certain ways, about what it all meant. She had been answered honestly and gently, and she had accepted the answers with a quiet, a serious expression that made those around her feel both proud and protective at once. The motorcade reached its destination as the afternoon light began to thin and pale toward gray. It was the kind of light that belongs specifically to late winter in England, not dark yet, but heading there as if the sky itself were settling into something more subdued. It suited the day precisely. Nothing about the atmosphere of that afternoon jarred or contradicted the gravity of what was happening. Even the weather, as if by arrangement, had kept itself understated. At the committal location, a smaller gathering waited those closest to the deceased, those whose relationship had been personal rather than ceremonial. William greeted them one by one. There were embraces here that the cathedral had not held space for. There were quiet words exchanged between people who were not performing for anyone, who had set down the weight of public duty for a few minutes and were simply, humanly, sad together. Catherine moved through these smaller greetings with warmth and attentiveness. She said the right things, but more importantly, she listened in a way that people feel rather than simply observe. She had always been skilled at this, at making a person feel, in a brief exchange, that they had her full and genuine attention. In a day full of formal choreography, it was the most human thing on offer, and people received it gratefully. The nation watched all of this unfold in real time on screens across the country. In living rooms, in cafes, and offices where the television had been left on quietly in the background, in schools where teachers had paused lessons, in hospitals where staff gathered briefly around communal screens between shifts, everyone was watching. Everyone felt, in some quiet corner of themselves, that this was a day they would remember, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. Because grief, when it is carried with dignity in public, has a way of touching something in every person who witnesses it, something personal, something private, something that belongs only to them. The final formalities were drawing near, and William and Catherine, standing at the heart of all of it, were carrying the weight of a nation's sorrow with a grace that was, in itself, a kind of gift. The committal itself was brief in the way that the most important things often are. There was no grand speech, no extended ceremony, just a few final prayers, spoken in voices low enough that the words felt intimate rather than institutional. A clergyman who had known the family for many years led the closing rites with a personal quality that distinguished it from the more formal proceedings of the cathedral. He spoke with warmth. He allowed silence its proper place, letting it settle after each sentence rather than rushing to fill it. The people gathered around him responded to that instinctively, standing very still, their breathing the only sound. William stood at the front of the small gathering, close to the end of something he had not yet found words for. He had spent the entire day performing duty with a precision that would have made anyone proud. And he had done it genuinely, not as a mask over feeling, but as a framework within which feeling could be managed. Now, in this smaller and more private setting, the framework was slightly less rigid. His shoulders, which had been perfectly square all day, dropped by just a fraction. His hands, clasped formally for most of the morning, now hung at his sides, not in defeat. In surrender to the truth of the moment, Catherine stood beside him, and at a certain point during the final prayers, she reached for his hand. The gesture was small and almost invisible to those standing further back, but it was there, her fingers finding his, a quiet pressure, a reminder. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes forward, but his hand closed around hers, and he held on. Those who witnessed that moment quietly and privately would hold it for the rest of their lives, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true, because it was two people behind all their titles and all their protocol, being simply and completely human with each other in a moment that asked everything of them. After the final prayer was read, and the last note of a short, simple piece of music faded into the still afternoon air, there was a moment of absolute quiet. No one moved. No one spoke. The kind of silence that is not uncomfortable, but necessary. The kind that has to exist in order for something to be properly finished. Then, gradually, people began to shift, to breathe more audibly, to let their bodies relax from the rigid attention they had held. William remained a moment longer. He looked at the place before him with an expression that was entirely private, something between acceptance and grief, between love and loss. Then he straightened, and the composure returned, and he turned to the people around him. He thanked those present with a few quiet sentences. His voice was steady, if slightly lower than usual. He made direct eye contact with each person he addressed, a habit so deeply ingrained in him by now that it likely happened without thought, but the effect was always the same. People felt seen. People felt that the words were meant for them specifically, not for the room in general. It was a skill that appeared simple but was, in practice, extremely rare. The return to Kensington Palace happened in near silence. The streets of London, which had been lined with thousands just hours before, were now quieter. Though small groups of people still lingered in certain spots, reluctant to go home, perhaps, or simply unsure where to put the weight of the day. Flowers had accumulated at various points along the route, great soft mounds of color against the gray London stone. Some people were still placing new ones as the evening came on, arriving after work in dark coats, crouching to add a single stem to the growing memorial back at the palace. William and Catherine were given a short time apart from staff and aides. A room had been set aside for them, quiet, lit softly, a tray with tea things left on the table. No one knocked. No calls were routed through for that hour. It was a deliberate, considered act of kindness from those who managed the household. The recognition that even people who carry public duties without complaint need, sometimes, a closed door and an hour where nothing is required of them. William sat, finally, in an armchair and said nothing for several minutes. Catherine sat nearby and did the same. The tea went unpowered for a while. The room held them in its stillness. Outside, the London evening had begun to settle in, and the sounds of the city, always present, always distant from inside the palace walls, drifted faintly through the windows like something from another world. Eventually, William spoke. Nothing significant. Something small and domestic, a question about the children, whether they had eaten, whether they were settled. Catherine answered in kind. And just like that, the day shifted into something that resembled ordinary life again, the way it always does eventually, no matter what has come before. The mundane is not an insult to grief. It is the proof that life continues. And continuing, they both knew, was what was required of them. Across the country, the evening news programs played extended footage of the day's events. Commentators spoke carefully, their tones subdued, choosing words with an awareness that millions of people watching were themselves grieving in quieter, more private ways. The footage of William and Catherine walking in procession, standing in the cathedral, moving through the day with such pained and deliberate dignity, played on a loop as presenters reflected on what had been lost and what had been witnessed. On social media, something unusual happened. The typical noise of argument and reaction was quieter than expected. People posted photographs they had taken from the crowds, blurry with distance, warmed by the human impulse to capture a moment even when the technology isn't quite enough. They shared memories. They wrote briefly and sincerely about what the deceased had meant to them personally, in their own lives, in their own families. They tagged one another. They said things that were small and true. A country in mourning does not speak with one voice. It speaks in thousands of small, private voices, each carrying its own story, its own association, its own loss. But on this day, those voices were all saying something that pointed in the same direction. They were saying, "We remember. We were here." This mattered, and in a quiet room at Kensington Palace, William and Catherine sat with their tea finally poured, and the weight of the day settled around them like something they would carry forward not as a burden, but as evidence of a life that had truly meant something. The morning after always arrives with a particular kind of quiet, not the anticipatory quiet of the day before, loaded with expectation and dread, but a different kind, the quiet of aftermath of something finished, of the space that is left behind when a great weight has been lifted and the body does not yet know how to adjust. Britain woke to that quiet on the morning following the farewell, and for a few moments in living rooms across the country, people simply sat with it. At Kensington Palace, the day began later than usual. There had been a silent, unspoken agreement among the household that the morning would not be pressed. The children had slept well, which was its own small mercy. William had not. He had lain awake in the deep hours before dawn, thinking thoughts he would not have been able to fully articulate. The way grief works in the quiet, it becomes less about the formal loss and more about the smaller things. A particular phrase, a specific memory, something ordinary that would never happen again. He was sitting in the kitchen when Catherine came downstairs. And there was something almost startling about the normalcy of it, the two of them in a domestic space. The morning light coming through the windows, the sounds of a household beginning to stir. She poured herself tea and sat across from him, and they talked in low voices about the previous day, not reviewing it as an event, but processing it the way people do when they have been through something together and need to let it settle. Between them, through conversation, William said that the crowds had stayed with him, that he had not expected quite that many people or quite that quality of stillness from them. Catherine said she had noticed the same, that there was something in the way. The public had gathered that felt less like spectacle and more like devotion. They agreed, without making too much of it, that the day had been handled well, that the people responsible for the arrangements had done their jobs with care, that the deceased would have approved, and that thought, more than anything else, they said, brought them both a small and genuine comfort. George came downstairs shortly after, still in his pajamas, his hair not yet combed. He climbed onto the chair beside his father and asked, with the directness of a child who has been told the truth and is still working out what to do with it, whether the person they had said goodbye to was now at peace. William looked at his son for a moment. Then he said yes, quietly, directly, without elaboration, and George nodded, accepting the answer, and asked if there was cereal. That was the morning. Later in the day, William returned to duties. There were correspondence items that required his attention, briefings that had been postponed, and a short statement to be finalized, a personal few lines that would be released publicly, expressing his and Catherine's gratitude to the nation for its extraordinary response. He worked on the wording himself. His aides offered suggestions, but he kept coming back to his own phrasing, cutting it down, simplifying it, removing anything that felt performative. He wanted it to say something real in as few words as possible, because he believed, and had always believed, that sincerity is most visible when it is not dressed up. The final statement was released that afternoon. It was short. It thanked the public for their presence and their tributes. It said that the love shown over the preceding days had been deeply felt by the entire family. It said that the memory of a remarkable life would be carried forward with pride. It said nothing that was untrue, and nothing that reached beyond what the moment warranted. It was exactly right. The public response was warm. People shared it, commented on it briefly and with genuine feeling, and then returned to their own lives, because that is what grief does when it is handled well. It does not demand permanent attention. It asks to be acknowledged, and then it allows you to move. The acknowledgement had been given, fully and with great care, and now the country was ready to breathe again. Out at the memorial sites, council workers began the quiet process of gathering the flowers. This was always a delicate thing, the clearing of a memorial, because the flowers represented something real, and it mattered how they were handled. Volunteers had come to help, and they worked carefully, separating blooms that could be donated to hospitals and care homes from those that had already softened past use. The notes and photographs and personal objects were collected separately, to be cataloged and preserved. None of it would simply be thrown away. That decision had been made deliberately and communicated publicly, and the knowledge of it brought its own small comfort to those who had left their offerings. In the weeks that followed, something observable happened across Britain. It was not dramatic, and it did not make the headlines. But people who paid attention to these things noticed it. There was a slight increase in the numbers visiting memorials and national sites. There was a small but measurable rise in people reaching out to elderly relatives they had not called in a while. There were more conversations in ordinary places, at bus stops, in queues, in the break rooms of offices, about life and legacy and what it means to matter to the people around you. Grief, when it is shared publicly and held with dignity, has a way of doing that, of reminding people of what is important, of pressing gently on the parts of daily life that had grown numb. William and Catherine, for their part, returned to their public schedule with the same commitment they always brought, visiting community projects, attending engagements, carrying out the work that fills a royal diary and that represents, in its own way, a form of service. They were not unchanged by what had happened. No one who carries grief ever is, but they wore it in the way of people who have learned that loss, rather than diminishing life, can deepen it can make the things that matter feel more solid and more worth protecting. The nation had said goodbye, and in saying goodbye, it had also said something else, something about who it was and what it valued, and what it believed about loyalty and love and the quiet power of simply being there. For one another in the hardest moments, William and Catherine had led that goodbye with everything they had. And the country, watching, had followed.